Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Late Night Brew, where we talk brews first and then we get around to the business afterwards. I'm Robert Bartonica, otherwise known as Buck, and tonight we also ignore time zones, but still tonight on the show with me is Joe Cirillo, and we're going to be discussing Microsoft information protection to help make sure no matter where your files and data might end up, they're still protected. But first, Joe, thank you for joining me, and what are you having?
Well, Buck, yeah, I'm not much of a alcoholic drinker, so tonight my drink of choice in my Marvin mug is actually Hershey's chocolate milk.
Awesome and classic. I'm a fan of the Looney Tunes, and Marvin the Martian is always going to win points in my book.
He is one of my favorites for sure.
I have a agave wheat Breckenridge from Colorado. I'm remembering my breweries. Yes, fine Colorado ales. So it's
Nice.
unfortunately not as agave as I hoped. But let's get into it though. What's a good, for those not in the know, overview of information protection for Microsoft?
Yeah, sure. No, what is information protection? A lot of organizations have the need to basically protect their data, particularly around their sensitive data, right? They don't want leakage with regards to having sensitive information leave their organization and then suffer the impact from that. Usually it's a financial impact. So what information protection very simply is, it's a way of both classifying and protecting your documents and emails by applying what they call labels and label policies. So it's also interesting to note that, although we use the term Azure information protection, Microsoft went through, as you would imagine, a rebranding exercise a few years ago. And they created what they call this framework called Microsoft Information Protection. And so Microsoft Information Protection is actually the framework that Azure Information Protection, or AIP, falls under. AIP used to be the de facto service for classification and labeling, applying protection, encryption, and so forth. What Microsoft has done is AIP is still out there, but they took a lot of the functionality that was core to AIP, like labeling and applying labeling policy and encryption, and actually moved that over to the Security and Compliance Center as part of the Microsoft Information Protection Framework. But Azure Information Protection is still around, but a lot of the AIP components that exist in AIP are actually more around the on-premises discovery and classification, like with the AIP scanner and such, as well as the AIP client that you can use to actually apply labels to local files.
Yep. We all know how much Microsoft loves to change things. So I've been guilty of that for the last few months. I still call it AIP and Azure Information Protection. One of these days, I'll get around to actually calling it by its right name.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's hard.
Right, and then in probably a year it'll shift names again. How is it used? I mean, we already talked a little bit of why it's used, but what's the mechanism that the average person is going to encounter it?
Mhm. Yeah, so organizations do have to go through what they call a classification taxonomy. I can talk seriously, and what that is basically coming up with what I like to call categories of sensitive information. So, for instance, they may have certain data that is just for public consumptions, right? No protection has to be assigned to it. But then they also may have documentation that is highly confidential and cannot be released to the public, and maybe only certain individuals as well can only view that documentation. So by working with these, what they call sensitivity labels, you can apply these classifications to particular documents, and those are exposed to the end user through a variety of means. If they're using like Word or Excel, Microsoft has built into the Microsoft 365 Apps for Enterprise Productivity Suite the ability to apply those sensitivity labels as part of the core product. So once you light up those sensitivity labels, they get exposed automatically, natively through those FAT clients. But you can also, as I mentioned, install what's called the AIP Unified Labeling client that further extends the capabilities and the ability for you to manage those labels, particularly around if you did want to actually protect, let's say, files on a local file share, situations such as that. So yeah, that's typically how it's exposed to the end user. But I will say that it's very critical that organizations spend a lot of time with making sure that they have the proper user adoption and change management and training associated with them, because as you light them up, and you have to make sure, of course, that the label names are relevant and a little bit self-explanatory, but a lot of end users can get confused by what each label actually means and what it actually does. So you have to make sure that you have the proper training associated with that release of this functionality so that the users know exactly how to use it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, nothing like throwing a big confusing change at a user base. And in my history of working with it, I found don't be granular. In the beginning, be as broad as possible. This is internal only. This is for external, and then once you get comfortable with it, start getting into that nitty gritty of okay, this cut it up into very very thin little pieces, and that's when we can get granular. So once that data has been protected, whether it's email, Word document, PDF, what have you, what are some of the things that organizations can do with that information? What feedback could you say that the labels give administrators and security operators to work with?
Mhm. Yeah, so well, it's a good segue into at least what exactly can you apply with the label, right? It's probably
Right.
a good first step, right? So as I mentioned, if it's a publicly available document, you wouldn't apply any type of protection. But with the labeling, you do have the option of applying not only encryption, but also some level of authorization from an identity perspective. So, for instance, I can apply a label that is only permissioned with, let's say, the finance team, so that if I go to the finance repository and open that document, as long as I'm a member of the finance team, I can open it. But if I am not a member of the finance team, then I would have no availability to open and read that document. And the beauty of that as well, with that encryption and authorization, is that it goes everywhere the document goes. So it doesn't matter if it's on, again, a local file share in SharePoint Online or sent to a foreign entity like a G Suite or so on and so forth. That protection travels with it, and only the person authorized to open the document would be able to open it. And then from an administrative standpoint, there's a lot of tracking that you can do with regards to the document as well. So you can see when a user attempts to open it, if they have been successful, if they have been denied. You can actually even revoke access to a particular document as well at any time. So yeah, there's a lot of great features involved, not only from the protection, but also the ability to manage that protection and revoke access when needed.
Yeah, that's huge, especially as you mentioned earlier, with the potential leak of data that could cost companies a lot of money, especially with GDPR and all of the PII that incorporates for any kind of international business, which I'd say most business on a larger scale is
Mhm.
going to fall under that blanket at some point.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I will say, implementing this is not a insignificant undertaking either, right? Microsoft certainly recommends the crawl, walk, run method of implementation. It's usually best to, come up with your classification taxonomy, whatever labels that you're going to have users get used to using and applying or seeing. And usually you should err on the side of short or small or few rather than many, right? So maybe 3 classifications to start with, very simply. You can do sub-classifications, but at least at the root, keep it simple, keep it short, and come up with just some key note classifications. But again, the recommended implementation approach would be to start simple with just the ability for users to self-label, right? And a lot of times it's just getting used to the seeing the label and applying the label without actually applying any encryption as a sort of a phase one. So phase one is very simply start to crawl. get your users adopting, the labeling methodology and classify all that kind of stuff. Yep. And then you can start layering in like protections, right? Encryption or so forth. You can even start layering in as part of that too some automation where based on data loss prevention policies, like if you're looking at for like PII data, like credit card information or social security information, you can actually have, if a piece of data contains personal information, have it auto classify or auto label with a certain encryption level, right? So that would sort of be the next stage. And then as you keep layering on, stage 2, stage 3 would be including things like data loss prevention, incorporating that into your classification strategy. And then, of course, all of the usage tracking that you were talking about and monitoring. So.
Yeah, automation is a beautiful thing in the modern tenant too. So that really helps a lot and helps take a little bit of that human error element out of it. But unfortunately, that does wrap up our time today. So I hope everyone enjoyed a good drink. And Joe, that chocolate milk, I hope didn't go to your head too quickly. And thank you for joining us.
You betcha. Thanks for having me.
Always. And if you have any questions, feedback, please do get in touch. Our contact info is below. And if you have an idea or a suggestion for a future episode, we'd love to hear it. Until next time, have a great night.